Right, so thank you for coming back, guys. There's a second part to this discussion, which is the demand side, where we will consider how some of the consumer barriers to the mobile internet, including access, literacy, and digital skills, and local content have relevance in the debate that we're having. And joining me here are, in no particular order, but start at the end, we've got Kartik Sheth, who's CEO, Data and Services, Airtel. We've got then Eric Hausman, who represents BRIC. He's the CEO there. You've got Chris Burns, who represents USAID. And we've got Mark Sermon from Mozilla. Thank you, gentlemen. And it is gentlemen this time all around. And what I will do is, since we've already sort of discussed the opening, I wanted to go straight into some questions with you guys. And Mark, if I may start with you. Sure. How can digital literacy be improved? Very simple question. I'm sure there's a bigger answer.
Just like that. We're done. On to Chris. No, I mean, it's interesting. Most people may think of Firefox and Mozilla very much as on the software side, which of course we are. And as you may know from last year and then some announcements today, very much on the supply side with low-cost smartphones, a big deal for us. But the digital literacy piece for us is as big a deal. In the course of the next 10 years, the vast majority of those 4 billion people who are not connected are going to be connected. So, we will, within 10 years, have most of the planet on the internet. And the question is, doing what? In what relationship to the economy, and what relationship to information? Is it something that's going to unlock people's lives, or is it something where they just become consumers? And that for us, as a nonprofit who believes in an open internet, it really is as important that we empower people to understand how to unlock their lives when they get their first smartphone and when they get on the internet for the first time. And so we've been doing some stuff, including with Zuhair's team, looking at how do we get the industry out there to not just look at access, but look at a massive scale of growing digital literacy in the next 10 or 20 years. Like, how do we get billions more people to understand what they can do with their smartphones, with the internet in the next 10 years? And that is a kind of challenge at a pretty grand scale. I mean, not that different than when we moved from agriculture to the city. We had to invent universal education. How are we actually going to do that with digital literacy? And so we've started, very modestly in the last couple of years, including we've been doing some studies with first-time smartphone users. India, Bangladesh, and Kenya are the first countries who've been doing that in the over the last year. And two interesting things out of that. One, unsurprising, people want to do things with their devices in local languages that relate to their lives, to their businesses. There is demand there. But people's understanding is very disconnected from people's use. So we often find you'll talk to a first-time smartphone user and say, well, and this comes up over and over again in the research. Do you use the internet on your phone? It says, what's the internet? And say, well, what do you use it for? Do you just use it for phoning and texting? Oh, no, I use Facebook. And the idea that what's possible on the device is just Facebook in many, many cases, or one or two other apps. And so there's a big gap in terms of what is possible with this general purpose computer that people have in their hands for the first time with a great data connection, and then what they actually do. So one of the things we really want to do, and it's, I love Facebook, we certainly support the idea that access and getting something to people is useful. But what has created the internet economy is this open-ended system where anything is possible, where independence is at the core of what is possible. So what we really want to do in terms of what's possible, what needs to be done, is work with the rest of the industry to help people understand what is possible with the internet on a massive scale. And there's three pieces to that be interesting to debate. One is fairly traditional digital literacy training, but focused on getting people making stuff, making web pages, making apps quickly. And so we started work on that a couple years ago with our volunteers around the world. We have a massive volunteer network, about 20, 30,000 people, and have been doing just very informal, free digital literacy workshops, I guess in about 80 countries at this stage. And so that's something we want to do more of, do more with carriers, more with the rest of the industry. It's low cost and it can have a tremendous effect. And it actually has a double effect because it's young people who do most of that training. Actually helps them in their careers, as well as it tends to be young people who want to learn these skills. But we feel like that is not going to, getting 4 billion people to workshops probably is not viable. So we might need, a few other techniques. And so the two other things that we're exploring are, one, an independent web publishing app that gets you making first. When you first get your smartphone on, the first one you bought, that you can be making a web page within 5 minutes in the same way you might with Instagram, but that's an independent web page. You can put it anywhere. It can become a sophisticated app very quickly. Over time, it's something that onboards you to much more sophisticated use of the technology. And again, it's open source and independent. It's about getting people into the whole of the web, not just Facebook. And then the other thing is just, which we can be doing with carriers, is massive social marketing about the fact that this phone actually can enable your business. Like imagine, why do we not have billboards that say, yes, sign up for Airtel, sign up for Aridu, but like sign up so you can get your business online. And we can be educating people at a massive scale in the same way we have about health, around smoking, all of those other things that really puts digital literacy into the water. So we're looking at how do we try techniques like that with the whole industry. And I think we can go forward quickly, but we can't do it with traditional education techniques. And we can't just rely on government to do it. The industry has to step up.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Chris, you're focused on digital development in what you do. How do you think the internet and the content on the internet can be accessed by so many illiterate people who are coming onto the internet today?
774 million to be specific.
That's correct, yes.
That's all.
I wanted you to say that.
Thanks, Zuhair, and thanks everyone for being here today. I think in order to get that many people online, it's really about making the internet meaningful, accessible, and affordable. That's really the formula. And obviously, to actualize that formula is much harder than just saying 3 words. But I don't think it's about going around to community by community around the world and teaching 774 million people how to read, just like you can't bring 4 billion into a workshop. The fact of the matter is, if you have a strong network connection, you have a device in hand, you can afford the services, you have the permission to use the mobile phone, which is still an issue for many women, particularly in emerging markets. Even if you know how to use the phone, if you don't have the content that is meaningful to someone's wants and needs and livelihoods, then the rest of that is really moot as far as I can tell. It's obviously very important pieces of the puzzle, but the local content piece ends up being oftentimes the last piece of the puzzle, but I think more and more is becoming one of the most important. And if you even take Kenya, the darling of East Africa for now, and look at the fact that ICTs are driving 12% of GDP and 99% of internet users are getting online through their mobile phone, and there are really high literacy rates in that country. The fact of the matter is only 30% of people are getting online. Why is that the case? It's really around issues of consumer awareness and some of the digital literacy and local content issues that are just really nascent in that market and really are holding people back from figuring out what is the information that they want to find to enhance their lives, where do they go for it, and how do they really put that to use. And I was in Ghana a few weeks ago, northern Ghana, right by the Burkina border, and really saw the same thing playing out there. Sure, just about everyone has a phone, but what are they doing on it? They are calling people, and that is it. And they really haven't even realized that this really is a powerful tool for them to really build out their lives and really enhance them in ways that we, certainly as USAID, wants to see in ending abject poverty. And when we're talking about underserved populations, it really is about getting into the meaningful part of this. I'm not going to really touch on the affordability piece because Sonia covered that a lot in the previous panel, but beyond the education content, the livelihood content, I think, is what really matters here, particularly given the fact that 40% of Africa is still in rural areas, 50% of Asia is still in rural, remote communities. The livelihood information that they really don't have a lot of access to in a lot of information deficient communities, people are relying on their neighbor or a community leader, or maybe a radio show, maybe one TV station. That's about it. That's where they're getting their information. And they're not able to curate it for their own lives. They're not able to personalize it for what they want. It's really relying on what others tell them. So by making the internet more available and meaningful, then you actually have the power to unlock the wealth of information that we all have at our disposal that people in rural communities don't have in the absence of a library or an internet that's available to them. And I think Mark would agree with me. He started to suggest this, and we both wrote about it recently in an MIT Innovations Journal, that I think part of making content and making the internet meaningful for people is about turning the consumer into the creator and really helping to drive what she wants to see in her life and what she wants online and how she goes about being a part of her community and putting the information out there that her neighbors really are fiending for. And I think that's an important piece of the puzzle as well. And I think just the last point to make right here is I appreciate that we've separated these panels into supply and demand, but at some point you can't decouple the two. Sonia talked a little bit about where governments come into play and how important they find digital technologies to be as a human right or as an economic driver, and the fact that a lot of ministries are really fighting for resources. To use Indonesia as a quick example, through our Global Broadband and Innovations Program last fall, we helped get their new national broadband plan signed and out the door. And part of the National Broadband Plan was relaunching the Universal Service Funds for Indonesia, but then linking them to the Ministries of Health and the Ministries of Education, because there was this recognition that consumer awareness, digital literacy content is what's going to get more people online. And it's the health information that they really need. And because the Ministries of Health are well positioned to do that, it actually makes sense to bake them into the USFs and the tendering process and the National Broadband Plan to build out the power for mobile internet throughout Indonesia. So that's just one example where I think the supply and demand come together.
Eric, it sort of segues nicely into what you do, which is, how do you see local content being created through local entrepreneurship, and your view on that?
Yeah, so that probably speaks more to my background with the iHub in Nairobi. And so there was a study that was done a couple of years ago by Vodafone Group about the mobile web. And one of the interesting things was the drivers of diffusion of the internet are the big international news sources or sports scores or global platforms like Google or Facebook, and that's kind of normalized now wherever you go. I think some big drivers of growth come from what both Mark and Chris were talking about, which is the fact that the internet's a read-write space. Like, it's not just about broadcasting information, because we have other sources for that. It's also about the possibility that people can create their own things, and we haven't spent enough time on that. And I think we're starting to see it. We have startups in our area that deal with agriculture or they deal with energy or whatever it is, and they allow people to send information back in, and that's an important component of it. But where are the micro trading platforms that are hyper localized? Those kind of things. Those are still coming up in some regions. I see them more in Southern Africa than I do in Eastern Africa. Some in Western Africa as well. And by and large, they start at the higher end of the value chain and don't really trickle down to the lower end. And so there needs to be some focus on that, and I don't think there's enough of it yet. So the biggest problem we have, and actually Mark and the Firefox and Mozilla team did some really great stuff doing user studies in East Africa and other countries as well. But they did some stuff in Kenya around studying what people do with devices when they get taught how to make something. And it was fascinating for me to see some of that research and see that people actually, there's a great desire to do something, but the capabilities to do so aren't there yet. They can be learned within a day, generally speaking, and they can be transferred between people fairly easily as well. but you have this bigger problem, and this is also to what Chris is saying, which is like it's hard to decouple the demand and the supply because what is one of the biggest barriers that we see? So as Brick, we make internet connectivity device for emerging markets, and you might have a smartphone, but if you don't have power, you're not going to do anything, right? So you can't decouple that part of the infrastructure from this kind of drop a tower as an island of internet. It doesn't matter if you don't have an island of power as well, right? How about inexpensive data? Kenya is very cheap. I think it's the cheapest in Africa. But you get down to Botswana, and you're being charged something like, I think it's close to $50 a gig, and it gets pretty steep pretty quickly. The mobile devices themselves, they're getting cheaper, but they're still inaccessible to people who live, on the rural side of the equation. And people talk a lot about the digital divide in Africa, and it's not rich and poor, it's rural and urban. So there's a bunch of other things that have to come together here to answer that, affordable, accessible side of the internet to make it really work. And just kind of to end it off, it's like, if we don't think of it as a read and write type of internet, then there's nothing different between this and radio. And we should just do the same thing we do with radio then.
Kartik, you are on the practical side of this stuff and out there in the field where you're experiencing, obviously, customer demand. And what's your view on the accessibility of content and the availability of it?
So let me start first with India and where it's going right now. It's today the fastest growing smartphone market. We're at about 20% penetration, adding 5 million devices a month, and roughly equal number of internet users a month. So that's all the good stuff, right? And obviously that has meant a huge thing for data revenues. Data revenues are growing, networks are growing. There's a virtuous cycle of investment. But this growth is a bit shallow. So only half of about the smartphone users actually use the smartphone for data of any meaningful manner. It is also demographically very, very skewed. So 4 out of 5 users, 3 out of 4 to 4 out of 5 users are men. About 2/3 of users live in urban areas. 80% are below the age of 35. Right. So if you are a young urban male, the chances are that you are definitely on the internet and you have a smartphone. But any other demographic you tweak and the fall off is very, very dramatic. And that's where the challenges lie. That's where the devices are growing. And for many consumers, it is the first touch point to the internet. And it does things that, in terms of usage, that you wouldn't normally relate with. Because most of us have seen a desktop, you associate a search bar with a magnifying glass icon. It is not natural to somebody who's seeing it for the first time on a mobile phone. When we have a program called One Touch Internet, which is a platform designed to get new users onto the internet. And little things that we realize in the UI is that a radio button is not intuitive on a touch phone, because you don't know that when you click in a menu will open, because you've never seen that happen on a desktop. So there are many different things that you need to play with. You need to play with languages. For us, again, I can talk about the One Touch Internet platform. The default language is English, but it's available in about a dozen languages, a little short, and more than half the usage comes from those languages. It's also needs to be visual. So language is one barrier, but literacy is another one. And most people will teach themselves enough. So I came across a driver in a remote part of India who spoke reasonable English. And I asked him, how did you learn that? And he said, well, my daughter goes to school, and when she comes back, I look up the words on my phone. Right? And so it's self-taught himself English. So now he doesn't have a problem, but that takes a certain amount of effort, initiative to get to that barrier. So just de-languageizing all the UIs, making it more visual, using regional language so that it's more read and less type, because at least all the languages in India, they're not Latin, so it's not easy to type on a keyboard with them, right? So the more read you have, the easier it is to get going. And once you overcome that first barrier of usage, you can then go on and do a lot more. So we did a bunch of consumer work to figure out consumers who'd made the journey. What is it that they did to actually get over this hump? And most of the time, the answer we got was, my son taught me, my neighbor's kid is a smart guy. I have a really intelligent cousin who's, helped me set up the phone, and then these messages started popping up, and then I figured out what to do with it. By the way, if I need to format my phone, I need to wait for him to show up again, right? And that's the real truth of how most people are getting on the internet. Somebody they know is helping them get on it. So we recently ran a campaign both digitally, on TV as well as on the ground, called Each One Teach One. The idea being that somebody taught you how to walk, how to swim, how to dance, how to drive. It's your turn to return the favor and teach somebody how to get on the internet. And those kinds of platforms are just making the people, the young urban male, aware that they're not an island and they need to go spread digital literacy, is what we believe will be the most scalable way of doing it. And that's what we're trying to do.
And I think you can't say anything better than that. That each one teach one approach is absolutely where we're going to get the scale. And interestingly, that's how 10 years ago Firefox actually kicked off, right? I mean, who else built a 400 million person market as we did in the browser with zero marketing? And it was each one teach one. And I guess the next step, I'd love to learn more about what you guys are doing, because it is similar to our philosophy. And one question is, for those each one teach ones, what are you asking them to teach? Because if we want to link it back to the local content piece, or look at content in a lot of different languages, we want all of those people, not just people who are in incubators or going to IIT, whatever, who are going to develop apps, but everybody to think that they're a creator of part of that internet, that they can step on and not only just learn a language or find information, but they can in a few minutes set up an app for the small shop that they have. And I think if we can mobilize that army of people who do feel comfortable with the internet and smartphones, give them the tools that they're not just showing Facebook, but showing ways to do things that maybe we think of as advanced, but we can make very simple. In the same way, we can de-language and also simplify app creation. So I think there's so much in what you're saying, and then what do we ask them to do then becomes a question. I think that the other thing that really is interesting is to underline, if local language is kind of key to the relevance question, and we don't want to just see the Facebooks and the big global companies out there, how do we organize the whole user base of all these carriers to be the solution to that? Because it's not going to be local startups alone, or even primarily, that address that. So I think that's another piece, is really to how do we see everybody who's got a phone as a potential part of really building out a rich local content ecosystem wherever they live.
Chris?
I think it's definitely appropriate to have much of this conversation focus around the smartphone, because that's how people are getting online. But given the cost realities that we still have facing us, not just with handsets, but as Eric mentioned, a lot of markets, data costs are still exorbitant. I think there are still a lot of assumptions baked into the ability for people to get online if you hand them a smartphone. And the reality is the internet is really daunting, especially for first-time users. It's still daunting for me. You fall down a rabbit hole and you can never really dig yourself out. So there are a lot of different... There are a lot of differences, obviously, in terms of being digitally literate. And there's a big difference being able to engage with a basic handset than going online. And I think it's just worth underscoring that there's still a lot of relevant 2G information out there to be transmitted and disseminated. That doesn't mean it necessarily has to be done through a dumb phone, but we do have to look at the channels of delivery, back to my earlier point of making it accessible, so that people who might be less inclined or less comfortable navigating the internet can still find ways of embracing this information and also manipulating in a way that provides meaning to them.
With the cost of data thing, there's something that we've been playing around with, which is really hyper-localized caching. And we've seen this already in use cases in Tanzania around education, where there's videos or applications they need to access to do things. to call that from the cloud or just call it from a web server somewhere is too expensive or too slow because they're on 2G connections or something like that, where we can trickle load content over the, the 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. period, right? And get new content in there. They can't do it during the day, especially with 20 people connected to either Chromebooks or tablets. Is really what they're using. So what can you do about that? Well, you can do some localized caching of the heavy content. And I think that's one way to bypass some of the costs and also increase the usage of localized content and international content at the same time. There's no reason why. Well, actually, so one of the examples of localized content is what the Equity Bank Foundation is doing in Kenya, which is they're taking a look at what people have done at like Khan Academy and other places and saying, well, wouldn't it be more interesting for Kenyan students if this was read by somebody with a Kenyan accent and explained in a more contextualized way to, in a Kenyan way to it? And so they're recording those videos and making them accessible locally. Again, localized cache of that content makes it a lot more easy to get access to. And then you can still go to the internet for certain things, but you don't have to go to it for all the content. I think that's one way to get around some of the cost issues.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk a little bit about cost as well, because the reality is, and we have one of the highest costs of spectrum and one of the lowest charges for data. A 1 gigabyte plan in India costs you about $3 for a month. So it's not that expensive, but it's still perceived to be. Yeah. And the reason for that is that most consumers, and I would say, I consider myself quite tech savvy, but struggle to understand how many megabytes and gigabytes they use.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? And it's not necessarily about how much you paid, but the fact that you didn't know where it went. And that's what makes it feel a lot more expensive and a lot less value. And the more we can make it intuitive, especially for first-time users, and then graduate them to a point where they can buy gigabytes and megabytes.
So how do you do that in practical terms? I mean, you're obviously addressing those customers today.
So we've done a few things. Around about a year and a half ago, we launched a product called the Rupee One Store, which is an entertainment portal where everything had a fixed price, and that included the content cost as well as the data charges. So when you clicked on a video which said 1 rupee, the video played, and then at the back end we paid the content developer a part of that fee as well. So it's kind of by making the pricing more intuitive. So we have a music application service called Wink, which is it's a service which is OTT, but it also has some of these tenets built in. So for example, a subscription gives you access to 500 songs. Yes, at the back end, those 500 songs are being managed through some megabytes, gigabytes, but as a consumer, you never need to see it. So, and I'm not saying this is for everybody. Once you've got used to using more than 4 or 5 services on the internet, you want megabytes because you want the freedom to do whatever you want. But it is important to, as you think of developing services, and it's true for anybody who's an OTT developer, anybody who's, we have the same debates with many of our OTT partners, and trying to tell them, well, when you're playing a video, please don't do adaptive bitrate. Right? Because adaptive bitrate on video means that I could use anywhere from 50 megabytes an hour to a gigabyte an hour. I have no idea how much is gone. Give the consumer an estimate of this is how much this video will cost me if I was to watch it. So at least consumers know where it's going. And once you've done that, the cost itself becomes much less of a barrier, because it's more about the understanding rather than the actual denomination.
So price packages for entertainment as a gateway drug to the internet?
Something like that.
I like it.
We are down to the last 10 minutes. Again, it went by very quickly. But I want to open this up to the floor for questions from the audience. Yes. Can we have a mic over there, please?
I'm here. Hi, my name is Anand Sjombar. I'm a PhD student looking at social media for development. The question was already faced talking about Facebook and the fact that it opens up the internet, or some people think Facebook is the internet. But is that digital inclusion? I mean, if Facebook is filtering the information you can see and there is no read and write, or it's only write like, not an unlike, is that inclusive? Is that democratic? Is that the future?
That question?
So my answer is no. I mean, I actually am incredibly afraid about what happens if internet.org succeeds. And it's not something that a lot of people say around here. Now, I also use Facebook every day. And so I actually don't have anything against Facebook. I actually think it is a great way to get people acclimatized. Like, what do you want when you get on the internet? You want your friends. And so that part's not bad. I mean, it's a great service. But the structure of effectively recreating what we had with AOL, where a set of negotiated commercial relationships control what you see with that free data. So it's AccuWeather, it's Wikipedia, who I also love, and a few local sites. What that does actually fundamentally changes what people, for the first time, see the internet as. And also, if it's tremendously successful, change the fact that the internet is an open marketplace for ideas. And this is the fundamental thing that we are possibly at a crossroads of losing. The internet is an unfiltered open marketplace for ideas. And if we actually go down the path where hundreds of millions or billions of people are not introduced to it that way, and the economic shift that you completely trade access for a very narrow view on what is possible, we are going to screw ourselves and lose what we have built. And so I think the big thing is that, for me, it's actually not about inclusiveness. It also is. It's that we need to consider, promote, be behind the internet as an open marketplace for ideas. And frankly, the bigger risk for me is if you don't have that open marketplace, it's hard for local businesses to compete and succeed. It's hard for groups like, based in iHub, to do a startup that's going to succeed across East Africa. And ultimately, you look at Palo Alto and Mountain View being the economic capitals of the planet, and it becoming very, very difficult for people to get in when the kind of imperial control is that complete. So I'm concerned, and no, I don't think it's very inclusive.
Karthik, you wanted to say something on that?
Slightly different point of view. I guess Facebook is one of the more popular services, and it is probably one of the first services that people who get onto the internet use. Thankfully, that's not where people stop. And once you've used Facebook, you will go on to use either an instant messenger service, or you'll get used to watching videos and discover there is something called YouTube through the feeds. You start taking more pictures, and then therefore a bunch of other things that you discover. So it's a great way to get started on the internet. So I'm not wedded to the first few steps, and because everyone is going to find a different journey. And if Facebook is actually delivering that first experience really well, enough to get more and more new users on board, I think that's a good thing.
Very good, thank you. Another question from the floor. We have just about a few minutes left.
Hello, my name is Andrea Thomas from Dahlberg Global Development Advisors, and I wanted to follow up on the point around how people are learning how to use the internet and how to get online through their network, the people that they know who are teaching them, and the vision about each one teach one with a young urban male, I think is how it was described, spreading the message of digital literacy. And I wanted to ask about women, because there is a gender gap, and I'm curious to know what the specific strategies are so that as digital inclusion progresses, that gap is closed rather than made wider.
But let me start with that since I brought up the point. In India, it's probably the worst gap pretty much globally, because it's a 4:1 kind of ratio for men and women on the internet. Some of the ways to overcome that is cultural, and we've seen some of our competition do some good advertising around that to make access to the internet a good thing for women and therefore become more culturally acceptable. But equally, it's about the right kind of content being available. And today, a lot of the content that's on and it's used for is largely entertainment. It's cricket, it's news, it's movies and music. Music and movies are fairly diverse, but there isn't enough content for women out there yet, and enough content for I would say middle-aged, middle-income, rural women to be online, and that's a barrier we have to overcome. I don't think we've even started on that journey, but the rich women are the rich urban women are online reasonably well, and they have enough content out there. They have enough of a social network online to make the usage levels actually higher than most men. But it is the woman who's not going out as much. It's probably not working, probably not that well to do, and making sure that there is enough quality content that interests her enough. We have to start on that journey. It hasn't begun yet.
Chris, you probably come across some of this in your work. What's your take on that?
Can I just say ditto in the interest of time? Obviously, this is something near and dear to our hearts, and our partnership with GSMA on the Connected Women program the last 4+ years is basically started our journey into digital inclusion. So when we talk about what it means to be fully included in the digital economy, and when we talk about the opportunity for someone to maximize what this tool can do for someone's life, the reality, of course, is that women, technology first isn't gender neutral. Women access it differently for different reasons. And there still is a gap, not just in ownership, but really in usage. And new report coming out this week that will really explain what usage entails for women, particularly in emerging markets. But I think if you try to package this all together, it really goes back to people as creators and online, and really to value the information that they want, whether you're man, woman, boy, girl, that it really has to be something that is relevant to their lives, relevant to their communities, relevant to what they're experiencing on a day-to-day basis. And you cannot, for the most part, find that information from elsewhere. With online being 55% in English and curated from largely Western nations, there's no reason to be telling a woman in Zambia what is important for her life. Mm-hmm. And so I think the more that she has the opportunity to experience that and make it useful to her, that's when you're going to start seeing some changes.
Can I just say one very quick thing? Ditto, ditto. And one practical thing to get to that is look at how women actually are going to create that information. And one of the things we've started to do with this WebMaker mobile app piece is user research oriented on that piece, not just what information women want to consume, but how they think about creating it. And we're finding interesting things that were surprising to us. Like, what we sort of thought for default, if we're going to make an app like that, people are going to want to publish broadly and publicly. Really, a lot of the women we're talking to want that to be only shared within a circle of 5 people, or for lots of cultural reasons you can guess. And so I think one of the things is digging into that research at a granular level of what does creating this content look like for those women. So if there are people who are working on that, that's something that we're very interested to dig deeper into right now.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. A very interesting discussion. We could probably go on for a lot longer. There is a Connected Women seminar during the week, and if you are interested in that part of it, I'd encourage you to go attend that, and some of your questions may be answered, perhaps not all of them. But thank you again for all your time. It's the end of the session.
Thank you.